Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Balmer here. Very pleased to be joined again by Bryan Alexander. Bryan is a senior scholar at Georgetown University, where he's been running some really interesting classes that we do want to talk about. He's also a futurist who's written a really fascinating book called Academia Next, which we talked a bit about earlier in the year, but 6 months is like a lifetime these days. And that's the last time we talked to Bryan. So Bryan, welcome back to Trending in Education.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's great to be back.
Yeah.
Thank you for hosting.
Yeah, no worries. And thank you for your service, where as someone who follows Bryan and Bryan's prolific, whether it's on Twitter or LinkedIn, or he hosts regular future thought leadership webinars every Thursday. He's really someone who I would encourage listeners to Trending in Education to track down. And also you have a website, right, Bryan?
I have multiple websites. You can go to bryanalexander.org, which is my kind of blog plus hub. You can go to ftte.us to check out my Future Trends report. Those will give you a good start.
Nice. Yeah. And also if you Google Bryan Alexander futurist, you'll find him that way too. And Academia Next is the other book that was prescient in many ways. And there were some ideas in there, particularly around the potential of a pandemic, that Bryan was talking about well in advance of the crazy year that we've had. And then since March, last we talked, you were just beginning to track the impact of the pandemic and the pandemic response to universities and campuses across the US back in March. And then that's something that really you've been continuing to collect all that information, share it out, and discuss with folks. Maybe we could start there, Bryan, where as someone who is looking ahead, someone who's a futurist, what's it like when you get something surprising like what happened with the pandemic this year? Many of us were caught off guard, but for you, you talked about this with some detail in Academia Next, and you did seem to be somewhat ready to respond to this crazy year that we've been living in. What's it like when a prediction or a possible scenario for the future then begins to take hold? What's that been like for you this year?
Well, it's been fascinating. Just to explain for viewers who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and you should. The book came out over the past winter, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And in the early chapters, I asked people to imagine different futures for higher education. And the book is an exploration of the next 20 or 25 years of American higher ed. And so one point, the now notorious page 23, I asked the audience to imagine what a pandemic might do to higher education. And I said, about the scale of the 1918 great influenza.
Right.
To imagine what that would do to, say, online learning, to college sports, to enrollment. And for a lot of readers, they didn't really notice that until March. And then saying, Alexander, are you in league with dark forces? What did you know?
Right.
And the thing is, for a lot of people, this was indeed a black swan. Black swan is Nicholas Taleb's term for an event that is incredibly improbable, very, very unlikely to happen. But when it does happen, it becomes enormously influential. And we also revise our past understanding to make it seem a little more likely, a little more comprehensible.
Yeah.
And the problem is, in the futures community, our very small profession, we've been thinking about pandemics for maybe 30 or 40 years. It's a staple. In fact, I've used this as an exercise in class before and in workshops. It's very, very, as a workshop exercise, it's very fruitful because it's a little orthogonal to our normal understanding of higher ed, and it forces you to rethink things, so it's pretty useful. But unfortunately, the futures community, although we've done great work on this, we weren't able to persuade the world to really pay attention, unfortunately. Which is an instructive story by itself. So I'm saddened that this is one forecast that I nailed. I hope some of my more optimistic forecasts come true instead.
Yeah, I'd love to get into some of those, perhaps, just because we could all use something optimistic at some point this year. But yeah, it was interesting. I remember when we met last, we were talking about lessons learned from science fiction and ways in which the folks have imagined what a pandemic might be like prior to it happening. Because I think when we last talked, it was early March and we hadn't really seen the first wave. Now that the first wave has passed through some parts of the US and it does seem like we may be gearing up for whatever comes next, any top level perception from you in terms of where we are and what the possible scenarios might be for the pandemic and the pandemic response in higher ed?
Well, back in March, I dove into some of the epidemiology and some of the modeling, and I came up with three possibilities. One of them was that we would experience a single great wave of infection, kind of what Hubei province went through and what some parts of the world have gone through. And to an extent, we might be on that. If you take a look at, say, the big arc from February through last week, it looks like amazing number of infections and deaths, but the rate of increase has been dropping for a few weeks. So maybe we're on the other side of that. It's also possible that we'll see successive waves. I know a lot of healthcare people are very nervous about November because when flu season hits, that may accelerate COVID cases. That is, getting the flu may make some people more vulnerable to being infected and injured by COVID. And also the general transmission of disease may make the two interplay together pretty well. People may be weakened by the flu and they're more susceptible to be killed or badly injured. So we may get successive waves like they're experiencing now, unfortunately, in Europe.
Right.
It's also possible that we'll just keep going with this. Yesterday, I noted this. We passed a very, very grim milestone of 200,000 dead in the United States, and we're coming up close to 1 million dead worldwide.
Wow.
And it may be that this will just keep roaring along. After all, we don't have a vaccine. I mean, even if we create a vaccine, and that is an if, because we've never created a vaccine for a coronavirus before. Even if we do, that has to go through trials. It has to go through already determined safety and efficacy. It has to go through production. It has to go through distribution. And this also requires that people actually take the thing. And while in the US, you've got the anti-vax movement. You've got a lot of people who are skeptical of this, and no doubt there'll be a politics to this. I mean, imagining if we have, say, a Biden administration, I could imagine the QAnon people circulating rumors that getting vaccinated will cause you to eat babies or something. And so if all those things do manage to work, we may be looking at another year, maybe more, in which case the pandemic could just keep roaring ahead. And then this forces us to rethink education. Do we assume that basically academic year 2020, 2021, is that basically going to be the pandemic year? So that most students are either going to be entirely online or they're going to be experiencing some kind of either blended experience, a high flex experience, or they'll be in person, but the in-person experience will be very strange. Perhaps low density populations on campus and restrictions on interaction and all kinds of stories about that. So we may just be seeing that kind of threefold experience unfold right now.
Yeah. And a lot in that summary there, which does bring to mind the idea of scenario-based thinking, which I know is a big component of being a futurist or someone who's trying to understand where the world might head. I've seen you talk in many different contexts about possible futures rather than trying to be pegged as someone who's foreseeing a single scenario in the future. Even on page 23 of Academia Next, it was a possible scenario. It wasn't saying this will be happening this year at this particular time.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about the benefit of thinking about possible futures and the benefit of scenario-based thinking for anyone, really? As you mentioned before, futurists are a relatively small, but perhaps growing contingent. But for folks who may be outside of that small circle, what's the right way to think about the future, and how is it beneficial to get into scenario-based thinking, possible futures, et cetera?
Sure. Well, let me just focus on scenarios. Futurists have a lot of tools in our toolbox, and scenarios are some of the most visible. A scenario is basically a story about a future, and it's a future that's determined by one or several things happening in a major way. So, for example, a classic one in poli-sci is imagining if a war breaks out in a certain way. So how do we handle a war between Pakistan and India, for example? or you can use it to shape other things. For example, what happens if we create a general AI that's more or less competent? And in education, we've created a whole series of scenarios, and I can get into this in a second. But why this matters? First of all, humans love stories. There's people who will exaggerate a bit and say we are essentially creatures of stories, but we do love them,
Hmm.
and we do love thinking through them. And in terms of futures work, a story lets you imagine yourself or your family or your community or your institution in a certain future, and it lets you think through the possibilities. This is really, really important when it comes to secondary and tertiary effects. There's a science fiction writer once said it's easy to predict the car. What's hard is to predict traffic jams.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, a scenario lets you think that through. It lets
Hmm.
you imagine that, oh, I'm driving around a car. Well, other people driving around a car. Well, how could this play out? So, for example, one of my scenarios is based on the idea that what if healthcare becomes the leading sector of the American economy? And there are all kinds of reasons for that to happen, having to do with just the unique nature of how we finance healthcare,
Yeah.
thinking of the demographics of growing numbers of older people who tend to
Hmm.
consume more healthcare and so
Yeah.
on. Well, then how does this impact higher education? So people get to think this through. Okay, does that mean if there's greater demand for healthcare professionals, does it mean that we have to expand pre-med programs, anesthesia program? Well, let's think about all the different parts of healthcare. Does it mean we have to expand psychology as a major? Do we have to add
Hmm.
more IT classes for, say, electronic medical records? How about hospital administration, undergrad versus grad school? How do you expand this and so
Yeah.
on? And then you think as well about, okay, what does this do in secondary school? Do you have more students in high school start positioning themselves for
Yeah.
a medical career? How does this change fundraising?
Hmm.
Do medical companies play a larger role in philanthropic donations to higher education and so on? So then you imagine whoever you might be, if you're a faculty member in a non-medical field, how does this impact you? If you're a
Yeah.
librarian, if you're an administrator, if you're a student,
Hmm.
how does this change your life? How does this change? So that's one scenario. The book has a stack of scenarios, trying to imagine different possibilities. So one thing to do is to just see yourself through one of those. But the other thing to do that's really exciting as well is to build a scenario. So you pick some kind of force that you think will have a strong determination on the future.
Hmm.
Well, to ask people to think that what kind of world would result from that? And that's a powerful, challenging, and very satisfying exercise.
Yeah.
One more thing about this, scenarios are very creative. Making them is an act of creativity.
Yeah.
And then playing through them is basically role playing.
Right.
Uh, I think they really unleash people's creativity, which I find very, very important.
Yeah, and I wanted to go there next too, because I remember during our previous conversation, once we began to talk about science fiction, things got even more exciting, which is saying something, because I think it was pretty engaging prior to then. But it does seem like there are aspects of futures work that are very closely tied to gaming and science fiction. And those are two things that I know it's something that you've done a good deal of work in, and even recently did a seminar class in this. And I'd love to hear more from you on any connections that might be applicable, maybe beginning with gaming and then also connecting into science fiction.
Sure. I think in general, gaming is an incredibly powerful tool for all kinds of purposes. Right now, it's arguably one of the world's leading culture industries. You know,
Hmm.
if you look at the sheer number of people who play games all over the place, everything from small digital games on phones to massive digital games on consoles and on PCs, as well as the big tabletop renaissance, which is
Hmm.
really, really fascinating. Not to mention we have a couple of generations of role-playing games.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by that as an object of study. I also think it's fascinating as a cognitive tool. And we know that over the past few decades, we've observed that gaming has a few different educational roles. So one is that people can play through games as a way of learning a content or a skill. And that's a very, very important tool. Another is that they can study games because games are very interesting intellectually. I mean,
Hmm.
you can look at them through the lens of anthropology, through history, through literature, through computer science, through new media studies.
Hmm.
On top of this, there's the pedagogical boon of students making games.
Yeah.
There are a lot of tools that let us make those from a very basic level to a very advanced level.
Hmm.
I think one more for that is the idea of, we could call it the co-curricular nature of games, that we have libraries as well as residence life who, for residential students and in-person students, would host gaming nights or gaming
Hmm.
sessions. but also we have the rise of esports.
Right.
A very, very important field. I've been working on this since the 1990s. I taught a class, or co-taught a class in 1999 and 2001 on the American experience in Vietnam.
Mm.
And a political science colleague and I created a political decision role-playing game about that, which the students found absolutely riveting.
Mm-hmm.
And so this past summer, I taught a full seminar at this. Georgetown University has a master's degree program called Learning, Design, and Technology, which focuses on pretty much what it says, learning and design technology.
Mm-hmm.
So we had our first ever seminar on gaming, and it was fascinating. The goal I had was I wanted students to play games, think about games, and make games.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to take them through all kinds of forms. So I wanted them to look at computer games, at tabletop games, and role-playing games. And at the same time, read scholarship about that. Look at the theory of how these work, why they matter, and how they can work out for learning. It was a very successful class. We had to wing a lot of things. We couldn't do tabletop because we couldn't be around the same table. So we tried to use different digital equivalents. I introduced students to role-playing games. And it was very interesting. Just especially the role-playing games were very sweet because the students some of them were initially very nervous about this. They just it was really eerie and creepy to them. They didn't see that, they had no experience of it, and they thought it was just odd. And then as we started playing, they got involved and got more involved. And when I stopped the game, they didn't want to stop. And that's always a good sign. We also used an academic game. I don't know if you've seen this. I want to recommend this to all of our listeners and viewers, called Reacting to the Past. It's a series of games produced by scholars all around the world. The Reacting base is in New York at Barnard College. Well, these are role-playing games about major moments in history. And what happens is you get a large group of people, easily a dozen up to 40, and they each play key decision makers at a major crisis moment. So some of the games are about trials, such as the trial of Galileo, or the trial of Socrates. Some of them are about political decisions, such as the Seneca Falls meeting or the Congress of Simla that decided the fate of post-independence India. And students have to dive into primary source materials, into secondary materials to learn their roles. And then they have to, through those roles, make a decision or come to a cumulative decision. And it's a terrific pedagogy. I had students do one on the Black Death. They all played participants in a small town, actually a small city in Britain. And again, they were awkward at first, but then they really got into it. And at the end of the class, the students produced a whole batch of games, everything from tabletop games to computer games to two of them dove into bingo and produced these very impressive, very accessible bingo games. I mean, one of them taught himself a programming language to finish his. So I'm very satisfied with that.
Yeah. And it does sound like there's a lot of themes in there. In addition to the gaming and the simulation theme, there's like problem-based collaborative learning. It's a very games. Many of these games are by their nature very social and social emotional, and it does remind me also. I'm a big fan of Yuval Harari's work, and when he talks about sapiens, part of what makes our species so adaptive is our ability to talk about myths, talk about fables, talk about things that are not exactly reality. Frequently, that is what allows us to activate others, activate their imaginations, and create shared meaning, move ourselves in new directions. Are there ways in which you think the academic world is ready to adopt some new tactics, whether they be collaborative learning, problem-based learning, game-based learning? In many ways, the pandemic and the response to the pandemic has been a catalyst for the acceleration of trends. I'd love to hear more, just from your perspective, what are the trends that are accelerating due to the pandemic? But just to begin, do you think there is an opportunity now to sort of shift the curriculum to things that are a little more scenario-based, game-based in terms of academics?
This is a fantastic moment for that. And let me just caveat that. When I talk about opportunities, when I talk about the positive possibilities, I do so in full awareness of the real horrors, the stresses, the anxieties, the challenges that we have.
Hmm.
I know some people find it difficult to talk about both of these at the same time. As a futurist, I have to look at all possibilities.
Yeah.
As someone who analyzes higher education, again, I have to be open to all possibilities.
Hmm.
So I want to make sure that when I'm talking about something that I find exciting and beneficial, that
Hmm.
is one part of a broader picture, which has some of the opposite as well.
Yep.
So we are, I think, in higher education, going through a rethinking of what it means to teach well in higher education. Research is not quite part of this. In fact, research is taking a kind of step back, I think.
Yep.
But we're really trying to figure out how to teach well, in part because the medium of teaching is changing. What it means to be in the classroom, if we have a blended class or high
Yeah.
flex. And so I think that has all kinds of potentials for work. There's also the extra fillip of fear that we fear that the reputation of higher education might take a hit. Online learning is often perceived to be of lower quality than
Yep.
face-to-face. So we really want to work hard on this. So we know active learning has all kinds of benefits. We know this from scholarship and practice for years. And so problem-based learning is one really great way of doing this. Scenarios, I mean, scenarios go back in a few different disciplines, particularly business and poli-sci for
Yeah.
decades. We know how to use them. So we have that option. The problem is partly we have the natural, you could call it inertia, you could call it conservatism of a lot of faculty. I don't mean that entirely as a critique. For a lot of faculty, they simply don't have support or
Yeah.
time to
Right.
rethink their work. And some of them are just very satisfied.
Hmm. Yeah.
The stereotype of the yellowed notes is a true thing. This happens enough. And then some find they have objections to these kind of pedagogies. They don't feel that they suit what they're doing.
Yeah.
And some are going through the cognitive process of translating face-to-face to online. And in that process, many go with a kind of copy and paste for a step. I lecture this way, I will lecture that way. I do small groups this way, I'll copy them over that way.
Hmm.
And the other thing is, we have, again, the extraordinary, literally extraordinary pressure of the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's one thing to rethink a curriculum if you've got time off to do that.
Yeah.
It's another if you see the world closing in around you,
Hmm.
if you're losing family members, or
Right.
if, plus for some people, they're experiencing the bigger impact of the pandemic in terms of finances.
Sure.
The U.S. staggers through a horrible recession.
Yeah.
So for example, if you're not teaching in the summer, do you devote time in the summer to revamping your fall classes, or do you do some part-time work in order to offset the possibility of a financial hit coming down the road?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we do have these possibilities, and I hope we seize them. Now, there are other trends that predate COVID that COVID accelerates.
Hmm.
One of them is the general, gradual, incremental shift online, which in Europe they often refer to as digitization.
Yep.
And you get some of that. This is accelerating that, obviously.
Hmm.
There's also the problem of higher education's financial sustainability. That's a deep problem. There's a lot to pick at, but I think most of your viewers and listeners will not find it controversial to think that published tuition keeps rising in ways that scare a lot of people.
Yeah.
The ownership of debt has escalated to just unprecedented levels in higher education.
Hmm.
And this terrifies a lot of people.
Yeah.
There's anxiety about the quality of degrees and the quality of experience. And all of this has pushed higher education to a kind of fragile moment where it's getting harder and harder to operate.
Right.
In fact, one sign of that is that while published tuition figures have been rising for especially the top, say, 30% or so of colleges and universities, we've also been discounting what people actually pay.
Right.
In fact, the kind of typical student pays something like half of what the published tuition is. So
Right.
if you have a $50,000 tuition for an expensive college, it turns out that for every student who pays $50,000, there's another one who basically pays nothing,
Right.
roughly, and then a lot of them pay $25,000, and that discount keeps increasing, which people in finance think is unsustainable. We also have other pressures. Public universities, which are about 2/3 of U.S. higher education, have seen state funding on a per-student basis decline for the
Yep.
past 25 years.
Yep.
And the pandemic is just going to accelerate that because
Mhm.
state budgets are being clobbered. They have less revenue coming in. They're having to spend more. And so we know across the country, north, south, east, west, red or blue state doesn't matter. Cutting public higher education is one of the first and easiest things to do. It has no political negative results for legislators or governors. So, and we're already seeing this happen in multiple states, like in Colorado, for example, and Iowa. So that's going to make, again, it's going to make our financial situation even more precarious. It's going to cause us to raise tuition more, to expand discount rates, and to expand student debt. Which is just, so that trend is frightening. Another one that COVID is really kind of as like a bank shot has accelerated is the movement to rethink higher education in terms of racial justice. That is to, in particular, to focus bias against Black and Hispanic students. And that's been building over the past, well, it may be for a long time, really. A part of that happened during the second term of the Obama administration. We saw it pick up with the Trump administration. But this summer, we saw it really take off and electrify the nation through the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And so right now, that whole sense of we should rethink higher education, we should make it a better place to support Black and Latino students, that sense is now really front and center. For example, I don't know if you saw this, the University of Chicago's English department just announced that for the upcoming academic year, they're only going to admit students who study Black literature, for example. You think about Princeton, where they're renaming buildings, and a massive faculty statement urged a really big overhaul of this university in terms of racial justice. That's the university that just yesterday got the #1 ranking from U.S. News and World Report. I think that trend is accelerating. And so those are a few.
Exactly. Once you get started, it's hard to stop. But you also mentioned optimism, which I appreciate your point, and I share the sentiment around being respectful of the tremendous loss and the suffering that is out there this year is something we have talked about a bunch on the show, and it's definitely something we are feeling. And we empathize, and empathy is a big theme that I think is everywhere these days. But what has been interesting to me as someone who does this show regularly is that there are increasing pockets of optimism. Maybe that is just human nature, that when things are dark, we need to find inspiration. We need to look for those rays of hope. Are there places where you are feeling hopeful, or you are seeing some favorable scenarios on the horizon, and particularly if they're tied to places where it requires activation, it requires change of our mindsets or our ways of working? I'd love to hear more from you on that.
Sure. So to go back to gaming for a second, I'll just build on that. Again, I think gaming has all kinds of possibilities. I mean, it's not a universal solvent. It doesn't work for everything, but I think it can really do an awful lot. This summer, I was part of an online event hosted by Arizona State University, and I was helping an event that I wanted to get people thinking about this moment, and I wanted them to think more imaginatively. So working with one of the event's organizers, we came up with this wild idea. We would have all the participants create a kind of on-the-fly monster manual. So for the viewers and listeners who don't know Dungeons and Dragons, one of the first crucial guidebooks for that game was the Monster Manual, which is a list of monsters and what they're like and how to oppose them and their strengths and weaknesses and so on. What I did was I invited all of the audience to think about the monsters of education and technology. And it was interesting because the few serious gaming nerds were all over this, but everybody else, it was making them concretize more general fears. So some of the fears were pretty large, like exhaustion or overwork or bad reputation. And then we can concretize them into characters. And this was playful, but it was also very serious. When I asked in the D&D Monster Manual, every monster has attributes. It has armor and so on. So I asked them to think about, what are the strengths? What are the attacks? What are their weaknesses? Who are their allies? And they were all over this. I did this by Zoom and in part by Google Docs, and they built this out. And then they went out the web, they found art and chunked it in. Then, so all this deep dive into fear and dread, I turned it around and said, okay, now that we're in a kind of cheesy, heroic model, who are the heroes who can fight these monsters? And I was really afraid that people would say, okay, Alexander, you've gone too far. This is too embarrassing. We're not children, right?
Yeah.
People exploded. They were saying parents. They were saying good
Mhm.
journalists. They were saying
Mhm.
nonprofit leaders. They were naming names. And I had them create these as characters. And by the end, people were energized and they
Yeah.
were feeling good. So I mentioned this. I'm not saying you should copy this. Please do if you like.
Yeah. Sure.
But also, it seemed to me that it was a way of thinking through this with our imagination and creativity.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of that pedagogical attitude that we can do a lot with. A
Mhm.
second is I think we have so much potential with technology. So, for example, on the high end, and by high I mean in terms of complexity, we have a lot of work being done in video as well as in animation as well as audio and
Mhm.
including 3D and even augmented and virtual reality.
Yes.
These are tools that we know we can use to improve visualization,
Mhm.
that afford a lot of opportunities for creativity from students and learners, and there's really a lot we can do with that, so we can really push on that field now. And so I think that's an area with a lot of potential. Again, there are downsides and
Sure.
flaws with any technology. The flip side of this is, for the first time in my life, we're actually talking about the digital divide
Yes.
seriously,
Yes.
which is amazing. A
Mhm.
lot of people, especially people who live in cities or people who have a lot of wealth, are just realizing that this exists.
Yes.
And so I don't need to rehearse the whole story of that, but now people are thinking, okay, well, if that's true, if we have this unevenness of access, how do we change digital teaching? So there's people who are doing things like shipping out hotspots.
Yep.
Bowdoin College, for example, bought a whole stack of iPads and they're shipping them out to students. All of the iPads have prepaid data plans for cell phone connectivity.
Mhm.
If
Mhm.
someone's in a region that doesn't have good Wi-Fi or good Ethernet connectivity, they can at least get on the cell phone network.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got stories of presidents who are driving Wi-Fi enabled buses into low signal strength communities so that people
Yeah.
can get on board. We've got libraries that are keeping even though libraries are closed, they're leaving their servers open, their Wi-Fi open, so people can park around them and get on board.
Mhm. Mhm.
And also we're thinking about what kind of low tech stuff can we do
Right.
to reach out to people. So maybe
Mhm.
we shouldn't do Zoom so much. Maybe
Right.
we do more with text. And so there's an
Mhm.
argument saying synchronous teaching, that live back and forth, we should downplay that, instead have
Yeah.
more asynchronous teaching. Okay, this is interesting. Stephen Downes from Canada was saying that we should downshift from video to audio.
Mm.
A lot of what we do with video is basically talking head. We may as well just go to audio, which is a fraction of the size in terms of memory, easier to
Yeah.
download, easier to make.
That plays to my strength. Someone who has a face for podcasting.
There you go. There you
So
go.
yeah.
We know this from podcasting, it's a huge success that
Mhm. Mhm.
but you can go back a century and think about the great history of radio and how much
Yeah.
people the theater of the mind, right?
Yes.
So I love that we're rethinking this really carefully now.
Mhm.
So that's another thing that I'm pretty confident in. The other thing I found just really exciting is that this is a time when we are collaborating. Now, not everybody is, because some respond in a very human way that when faced with a threat, we kind of we become like turtles,
Yep.
we withdraw our soft bits inside of the
Yeah.
shell.
Uh-huh.
We try to put up barriers and protect ourselves, and that's a very human thing. But there's some people who don't like to collaborate online because they don't like being online, or
Right.
they're
They don't
nervous.
trust it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But instead, we also have this huge possibility to collaborate. Community colleges can peer up with Research One universities that can learn from military academies, that can then hear from second-ranked state schools about
Yeah.
everything they do in this process.
Mhm.
People can work across discipline. No discipline owns COVID-19. I mean,
Right.
epidemiology, yeah, that's pretty essential.
Right.
But within healthcare, you think about, for example, how important gerontology and elder care is, because
Mhm.
that's the
Mhm.
population that's getting killed by this.
Yeah.
Or you think about psychology, because
Mhm.
even though the research field of psychology is more or less a dumpster fire right now, we know that the practice of counseling is
Right.
incredibly needed right now.
Absolutely.
And then go beyond that. I mean, talk to sociologists about the impact of social distancing on social interaction.
Right.
Talk to people in history who can tell you about the long history of pandemics and what we know about it.
Mhm.
I did a fun crowdsourced syllabus on literature of pandemics, which goes
Mhm.
back centuries.
Yeah.
What we can learn from that.
Yeah.
So I think like an interdisciplinary learning is also going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see this as a watershed moment in terms of our culture? Because I think there's the response to the pandemic, which in some ways is so fundamental in terms of how we organize ourselves socially and how we use technology, engage with our culture, that even if, let's say, 2021, a vaccine comes out and we're on the other side of the pandemic a year plus from now, the world that we'll be navigating into may not ever be the same as the world we were in prior to COVID-19. I'd love to get some of your perspective on that. And by the way, this is amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Obviously, as a futurist, there's no shortage of things for you to dive into. But I would love to get a little bit of your perspective on how much of this is changing the fabric of our society, so that in some ways it argues for jumping into the change, because there really won't be as much of an opportunity to go back. But I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on that.
I've been thinking hard about this ever since December, when the pandemic started. Well, before it was a pandemic, when COVID emerged from Hubei province. And there is some precedent for no change.
Mhm.
The great influenza of a century ago, no monuments mark it. It's rarely taught in history classes.
Mhm.
It doesn't have much of a public memory, in part because the medical field largely failed. If you read diaries and journals by nurses and doctors at the time, it's the sense of overwhelming despair that their new sciences could basically help people be comfortable. It's a horrendous tragedy that slipped out of memory. We could do that. That's always possible. But I think there are other possibilities for inflection. For example, we're seeing huge changes in our economy.
Mhm.
That is, we're seeing an acceleration, to mention acceleration again, of increasing income and wealth inequality,
Mhm.
where the wealthiest continue to accelerate from the rest of us,
Mhm.
whereas incomes have been stable, if not declining, over the past year for everybody else.
Yeah.
We're seeing changes in businesses where some are just collapsing or cratering. Hollywood, for example, is going nuts right now because they
Yeah.
can't coax people in the theaters, and
Mhm.
they can't make movies or TV unless it's on these single, one-man shows, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, my theory is that we're going to see more of animation, and we'll
Mhm.
see more of edited videos where,
Yes.
like Adam Curtis's great works, where people edit pre-existing video.
Yeah.
Um, the airline industry is in a, if forgive the expression, a tailspin.
Yeah.
But we're seeing digital companies just take off like mad, everything,
Yeah.
Amazon, Facebook. But we're also seeing allied fields really boom. If you think about the delivery services, a lot
Right.
of drivers, from what we can tell, shifted from doing Uber and like services to doing Deliveroo and others like.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're also seeing a lot of interest in home things you can do at home, everything
Yep.
from tabletop gaming that I mentioned
Mhm.
before, to
Mhm.
sewing. And so there's a kind of ripple effect through the economy. And we have the terrible effect of people who just lost income this year.
Yeah.
The census published a note this summer which said that something like 41% of families experienced one or more people in their families losing a job or at
Wow.
risk of losing a job.
Yeah.
Uh, so we know historically that this has impacts on wealth formation. So
Sure.
people are less likely to be able to save and put aside for retirement, for example. We know they're going to be more vulnerable to healthcare crises financially, not just physically.
Yeah.
And we know that people are just starting their careers now. So you
Yeah.
think much maligned Generation Z are
Yes.
coming out of the gate in the worst time possible.
Right.
So I think the economic impression is going to be hard and last a long time. And again, I'm not sure if we're going to be cognizant of it. We tried very hard to forget the 2008 financial crash. 2 years
Yeah.
ago, we had the anniversary of it. People did not want to talk about it, but
Yeah.
the impact was still very, very sustained.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about changes in the physical environment, Michael. For example, we now the sense is that circulation of air inside a building is
Yes.
bad news. Will we see more and more buildings that are renovated or constructed that
Yeah.
have more openings to the outside, bigger
Yeah.
windows,
Mm.
more bigger doors,
Mm.
porches, and deeper porches? And will we see interior spaces either become much larger in order to reflect social distancing,
Yeah.
or will we see smaller spaces for individual people to work?
Yes.
Uh, I think there's been some talk about redesigning restaurants
Mhm.
so that they are entirely drive-through,
Mhm.
which makes a lot of sense. But they don't have a dining room anymore.
Right.
Entirely for pickup. What happens, for example, with cars? People spoke of peak car over the past 10 years, and there was a lot of rationale for it. More and more Americans and more people who
Right.
were living in cities, where you need
Yep.
cars. But right now, cars are terrific social distancing mechanisms.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So are we going to see Detroit pick up a little lease on life? Will we
Right.
see more people owning and driving cars? As a side note, I'm a big fan of the Alamo Cinema House.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just love their whole approach to film. Well, they're doing drive-in
Yep.
movies. Well, physically going into a theater right now is kind of risky.
Yeah.
But if you could just pull up in a giant field
Yeah.
outside, you've got social distancing built in. Roll up your
Mm-hmm.
windows and you're good, right? That's
Yeah. Yeah.
so. Will we see just a rebirth of America's car culture,
Right.
which then down the road, if you'll forgive the expression, has some negative consequences. We know that Americans happily kill up to 30,000 people a year in collisions and accidents. So
Right.
we see that death toll start to rise up again.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's still more that I wonder about. There's a lot of concern that we are now having less experience face-to-face and more experience that's digitally mediated. So are we going to de-skill ourselves in face-to-face interaction
Mm-hmm.
when we finally get out and see people?
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't like to get personal about my work, but I can't share one anecdote, which is just that I'm a very outgoing person. I'm off the charts in extroversion,
Uh-huh.
love being with people. I am now terrified of people.
Mm-hmm.
When I go out for a walk, if I see someone on the street, it's a horror movie moment.
Yeah.
I flinch.
Yeah.
And I was in a drugstore 2 weeks ago trying to buy some medicine. And this is how I learned not to go to the drugstore. Behind me, 2 feet behind me, was someone without a mask.
Mm-hmm.
I saw them and I had this horrific fight or flight reaction.
Yeah. Yep.
Right under my feet. It was like seeing a zombie.
Yeah.
And I try to be polite. I mean, I try to be nice, but I actually hollered at this person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where's your mask?
Yeah.
And they actually shrugged at me and said, "Oh well."
Yeah.
I left. I just had to walk out because I couldn't.
Yeah.
But I wonder what happens. I don't know how representative my experiences are, but what happens to a society if we start meeting together a year from now?
Mm-hmm.
Will we still be flinching from each other?
Yeah.
Will we be more formal?
Mm-hmm.
More likely to use formal language and modes of address,
Mm-hmm.
or will we brace into each other's arms?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of the work of Edward Hall around proxemics and how humans organize physical space. Like it's gone through a fundamental reshaping, and we know how we get into behavioral patterns relatively quickly, like typically say 6 to 8 weeks. If your behavior changes, it can become a habit. We're going to look at 6 to 18 months of significant restructuring of our behavior patterns. It's really an amazing time to be thinking about what that might mean for the future. I realize we're getting close to time, Bryan, and we haven't even talked about climate change. So I think we're going to have to put a pin in that and get you back to talk more about that. But any concluding thoughts? It's just, you're a wonderful resource. I would encourage folks to track Bryan down virtually and with good social distancing if in person, but track him down. He's got a lot of work. If you found this conversation interesting, Bryan's cranking out a lot of this type of material on the regular basis. Any concluding thoughts? And I would love to get you back actually to talk more about climate change, because Lord knows there's plenty of that going on right now if we look at the wildfires out west. But any concluding thoughts from you as we try to wrap up here?
Well, we're talking about climate change in part because this is something I've been researching for the past year, and it's the subject of my next book, which is the impact of climate change on higher education. I'm looking out to the year 2100. So it's a deep topic, and I'd love to, we don't have time right this second, but I think in many ways that we have to think with a great deal of flexibility and a great deal of care looking ahead. And I have some things hearten me when I think about this. I mean, one is that I think we have a great opportunity to reconnect in a much more democratic way, lowercase d democratic way, with our students. They're having an experience that for some of us is almost impossible to imagine. Think about being 15 when this happens. Think about being 22.
Right.
I think this is a great opportunity for us to engage our students in how we co-create the future of higher education.
Mm-hmm.
We need to hear those stories. We need to bring them on board. We need their advice.
Mm-hmm.
We need students to help make this gigantic enterprise of higher education. A second thing, I mentioned collaboration. This is a great time to reach out to other people and learn and give help to people and share. And the third is, we are doing all of this with such an eye towards justice and equity. And again, that heartens me. It's just one eye, not two. You can see this from some of the fumbles and mistakes we're making. Just today, learning about the Big Ten universities deciding to play football after all.
Right.
But I think we have a concern now towards justice and equity that we really need to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
With all of that, I hope we can do so in a spirit of humanity and imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of the old Fred Rogers quote, anytime there's a real tragedy, look for the helpers, because there are always people who are helping. That's really a place where I've been drawing a lot of solace and hope really in these difficult times. And I will say Bryan is a great example of someone who is leaning in to help and leaning in to help with the reimagining of this. We could clearly go on at length. Love to get you back to talk more about climate change in the future. But for now, I think we're going to thank you for joining, Bryan. It's wonderful having you here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, for your hosting, for your questions, your good sense of humor, and your patience.
And for our listeners, thank you for all those things as well. Please continue to listen, share with a friend, like us, rate us, love us. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening. This is Trending in Education.